Good afternoon. I'm John Marchari, the Charles Engelhard Curator and Head of the Department of Drawings and Prints here at the Morgan, and I'd like to welcome you to a lecture celebrating the opening of our exhibition, Power and Grace, Drawings by Rubens, Van Dyck, and Jordaens. This is our first program of the new year, but we have much more to come, and we hope that you'll pick up our calendar of events as you leave in the lobby. I hope many of you have already had a chance to peek your heads into the exhibition, which is already open, or that you'll do so after you head upstairs after the lecture. The show is drawn mainly from the Morgan's own collection, supplemented by just a few local loans. Some of our lenders are here, and I'd like to thank them for their generosity in allowing their drawings to be shown here for the next 3 months. I can think of no better introduction to your visit to the exhibition than today's lecture by Ilona van Tuinen, the Annette and Oscar de Laurenta Assistant Curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints. She's also the curator of the exhibition. Ilona has been at the Morgan since December of 2015, and although she's been part of the curatorial team that has worked on exhibitions like the collections of Count Tessin and Drawn to Greatness over the past 2 years, this is the first exhibition that is wholly of her own creation, and it's accompanied by a beautiful, interesting, small catalog that is already available in our shop. It is also, unfortunately for us, the last exhibition that Ilona will be creating here at the Morgan. For it's with some sadness, but also with a great deal of pride, that we're about to send her off to her new position, for she has been named the new curator of Dutch and Flemish drawings at the Rijksmuseum, a position she takes up in just 2 weeks. And so, as I call her to the stage, I hope you'll give her a round of applause to welcome her. As usual, after our lunchtime lectures, we won't have any questions, or at least no formal question and answer from the stage. So, after she speaks, please give her another round of applause to send her on her way as she leaves for Amsterdam. Ilona.
Cry? Thank you, John, for those very kind words, and thank you all for coming on this cold winter's day. In fact, I have a bit of a cold, and I'm a little bit worried of either heavy breathing or sneezing or anything, so if I do, just look at the beautiful drawings, because they are beautiful enough. So since about 2 hours, visitors of the Morgan can walk into the Claire Eddy Thor Gallery, lovingly called the Cube, and submerge themselves in the sheer beauty of drawings made by the 3 titans of Flemish Baroque arts, Paul Rubens, Anthony van Dyck, and Jacob Jordaens. Visitors can marvel at the technical virtuosity of these draftsmen and at the power and the grace that all their works exude. These words, power and grace, echoed in the title of the exhibition, as you can see here, are in fact Rubens's own. In 1621, Rubens had disappointed the English ambassador, Sir Dudley Carleton, by sending him a painting of a lion hunt of mediocre quality, deemed unpresentable to the Prince of Wales. In a letter of September of that year, so 1621, he wrote to the English diplomat William Trumbull, King James's representative at the Habsburg court in Brussels, and in which he apologized and promises to make another painting entirely by his own hand, which the other one was not. Being the thoughtful but strong-headed diplomat that he was, Rubens went even further and suggested that the painting would be even better if he were allowed to work on a larger scale. And to support his argument, he mentioned that he had just finished another much larger lion hunt, which today we think is this one at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, which was, quote, entirely by my own hand and in my opinion, my very best, unquote. And Rubens even added that, quote, such things have more grace and power in a large painting than a small one, unquote. Now, whereas it is, of course, somewhat risky to isolate 2 words in a letter by Rubens and pin a whole exhibition title on it, it can be argued that in general, Rubens believed power and grace to be essential to his art. Accordingly, his constant search to achieve in his compositions the balance between the two lay at the heart of his artistic intentions. And the same can be said, although in somewhat different ways, but it can be said of Van Dyck and Jordaens, whose lives and careers overlapped with that of Rubens, and who were deeply influenced by the senior artist. Just how differently they went about achieving these effects can best be seen in their drawings. for it is there that we see the artist evolving, thinking, recording, and creating. This is certainly not the first time that the drawings you can see upstairs are on view in an exhibition. You may all remember Anne-Marie Logan's large 2005 exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the catalogue cover of which you see on the left, which featured many of Rubens' drawings and a few that are upstairs in the exhibition. Some of you may also remember Christopher Brown's important 1991 show of the drawings of Van Dyck, which was held right here at the Morgan and at the Kimball Museum of Art, which contained all the works by Van Dyck in the present show. And there were also plenty of overview shows, such as Rubens and Rembrandt in their century, which was held in 4 locations in 1979 and 80, including here at the Morgan. But never before have the works been displayed in relation to each other in such an intimate context. And the focus, this particular focus, for which the Cube Gallery is of course very well suited, enables us to compare the artists' techniques and approaches and to understand the different functions that their drawings played in their working practices. So, since about 2 hours, visitors can study up close 18 works from the Morgan's collection. Very, very rich holdings of drawings by Rubens, Van Dyck, and Jordaens, as well as 4 loans from local public and private collections. Now, as far as drawings by these Flemish go in the United States, the Morgan has the richest holdings. And the core stems from the important acquisition made by Pierpont Morgan in 1909 of the exquisite collection of European drawings from the English pre-Raphaelite painter and collector Charles Fairfax Murray, shown here in an early self-portrait from the Morgan's collection. Morgan's purchase immediately made him the most important collector of old master drawings in America, and during the decades following Pierpont Morgan's death in 1913 and the foundation of the Morgan as a public institution in 1924, the collection of Flemish drawings was enriched with a few key acquisitions. A notable example is Rubens' angel blowing a trumpet facing left, which was purchased in 1957, and therefore at long last reunited with the angel blowing a trumpet facing right, which had entered the Morgan's collection with the 1909 Fairfax Murray acquisition. Rubens created these angels in about 1617 to 20 as sculpture designs for the spandrels of the Jesuit church in Antwerp. And you can see it's not very well visible, but you can sort of see them here. So this is a very recent picture, so they still exist today. Gifts to the Morgan also played an important role in the further enrichment of the collection of the Flemish drawings, such as these youth drawings by Rubens, given to the Morgan in 1984, and the one on the left is also in the exhibition in one of the cases. Particular mention should be made of the exceptional collector Eugene Thor, who, as many of you know, sadly passed away just 2 weeks ago. This news is still very fresh here at the Morgan, and he is sorely missed. His transformative gift of more than 400 drawings, spanning 6 centuries and all European schools, was celebrated with the exhibition Drawn to Greatness last autumn, which many of you may have seen. Thor's gift contained some choice Flemish drawings as well, such as this charming study by Jordaens of his wife and daughter, which is now in the exhibition. And as we speak, the exhibition Drawn to Greatness is being installed at its second venue, the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, which is where the following 3 spectacular drawings from the Thor gift are not in the show upstairs. So what I'm showing you now is not on view, unfortunately. We have this, one of Van Dyck's early studies for a painting depicting Moses and a brazen serpent. We have Van Dyck's luminous portrait of Jacques Dubrouk, which is a print design for the artist's famous iconography series. And we have this pièce de résistance, as I may call it, which is Rubens' virtuoso pen sketch for a descent from the cross. So, all the more reason to travel to Williamstown this spring, where these drawings will be on view. Because of these important gifts, along with Fairfax Murray's choice collection, the Morgan can boast of an impressive 20 drawings by Rubens, 6 of which are in the exhibition upstairs, which I will briefly show to you here to give you a general idea of the works in the exhibition. We have this enchanting youth work, which we've already seen, which is a diligent copy of several woodcuts by the Swiss artist Tobias Stimmer that Rubens made when he was about 18 years old, just before becoming independent and moving to Italy. And I will go into this a little bit later as well. From his Italian period of about 1600 to 1608, there is this arresting red chalk bust of a man. This adoration of the Magi of a few years later, around 1613, is a design for a book illustration, which you can see here, which is also on view in the show in one of the cases. And then we have this poster boy, as we may call him, of the exhibition, our terrific study of a male nude in preparation for this large painting in Washington. And finally, we have these angels, which we have now seen a few times today. Still, the Morgan's collection of Rubens drawings does have some obvious gaps, which are not so much a shortcoming as a reflection of Rubens' larger-than-life stature as an artist, a humanist, and also a politician, not to mention his staggering output of drawings. We have about 700 of them still today, in a variety of techniques and with many different functions. Thankfully, the Morgan's lack of a good anatomical drawing is made up by this generous loan of an extraordinary écrochet study from the Casper collection of drawings and photographs, for which we are very grateful. And this splendid, recently discovered figure study from the 1620s from a private collector, and this stunning late watercolor from the 1630s, lent by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, make up for the absence at the Morgan of drawings from the last 2 decades of Rubens' career. Because you may have noticed that the drawings I showed you from the Morgan's collection are all made between sort of 1597 and 1617, so roughly 2 decades. Anthony van Dyck, on the other hand, is represented in the Morgan's collection by 10 drawings from his entire career, 6 of which are in the exhibition upstairs. We have 2 early compositional sketches from around 1617 to 1620, made in Antwerp during the time that he was working in Rubens' studio. On the left, we have the Martyrdom of St. Lawrence, in which the influence of Rubens' painting of a few years earlier is clear, and I will return to this example as well. And on the right, we have the wonderful Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine, which is one of 7 drawings that Van Dyck made in preparation of a grand painting at the Prado in Madrid, which you see here on the left. From his Italian period of 1621 to 27, this is maybe one of my favorite drawings, if not my favorite drawing of the show. This is his glorious sketch of Diana and Endymion, which I will discuss later in more detail as well. From the years that he spent in Antwerp after his return from Italy, we have this portrait of a woman and a child. And in this case, we actually know who the sisters are, namely Anna van Tuinen, who was the wife of the painter Theodor Rombouts, who had been in Italy during the same period as Van Dyck, and their daughter, Anna Maria Rombouts. The drawing was made in preparation of this painting, which is now in Munich at the Alte Pinakothek. Van Dyck spent roughly the last decade of his career in England, which is where he made this evocative and delicate pen drawing of the harbour town of Rye, south of London, on the 27th of August, 1633, as he recorded here at the bottom. He recorded Rye, and then he recorded the date. What is more is that we can even tell what time of day it was, because Van Dyck was drawing it from the northeast corner. You can even see the boats here on the English Channel on the left. And the light reflections on the rooftops on the right tell us that the sun was coming from the west, and therefore that it was the afternoon. So he was sitting here on a nice, glorious summer afternoon making this beautiful drawing. Finally, the show has this beautiful study for the dead Christ, which Van Dyck made towards the end of his relatively short life. He was very young when he died. I will return to this drawing as well. As for Jordaens, the Morgan's collection contains 9 drawings, all of which date to his mid and late career, so from the sort of mid-1630s to the mid-1660s. And that is mostly the period after the death of Rubens in 1640 and that of Van Dyck in 1641, when Jordaens became the most important artist in Antwerp. From the Morgan's collection, the show contains the above-mentioned portrait of the Thorgift, this lovely portrait of his mother and daughter, his wife and daughter. This designed for a tapestry depicting the satyr and the peasant, based on one of Aesop's fables. A design for a print, which is also in the exhibition, that's the double hanging on the right wall. And this depicts a young lady choosing a mirror presented by a jester over the skull presented by the old wise man. In other words, choosing vanity and foolishness over the contemplation of morality. And who can blame her, right? So here, see, this old man is giving her a skull, and here you have the jester who's offering her a mirror, and she's obviously looking in the mirror. There is also this colorful composition drawing of the victory of Minerva, seen here with her aegis, so the shield with the Medusa head, and she's trampling a follower of Mars who's sitting here with his helmet, and he's obviously been triumphed over because he's sitting there very unhappily. And there's Mercury here who's triumphing, and he sort of won because Minerva managed to triumph over Mars. I believe this is a ceiling, a design for a lost ceiling decoration. Finally, this is a compositional sketch for a painting depicting the 12-year-old Christ convening with the elders in the temple. So, since Jordaens' early career is not represented in the Morgan's collection, we are very grateful for this loan from a private collector of a spectacular nude study dating to around 1617, the period in which the young Jordaens was assisting Rubens in his studio at the same time as Van Dyck. So now that we have a general sense of the works in the show, let's have a look at some of the connections that we can make between these three masters. The first theme that this show highlights is that of looking at older masters. The three masters in this show relied heavily and even dialogued with the masters who came before them. Rubens, more than anyone, engaged with art from antiquity up to his contemporaries throughout his career, and one of the first artists to catch his eye was Tobias Stimmer. We already saw him earlier. Rubens' deep estimation for Stimmer was famously recorded by the German artist and theorist Joachim von Sandrart, who traveled with Rubens on a small boat from Amsterdam to Utrecht in 1627. We actually have a record of this. It's fantastic. It is not without some historical sensation, therefore, that we can picture these two great men slowly passing by the grassy meadows that look much the same today, full of cows and windmills, and hear Rubens telling Sandrart that he made copies after the so-called Stimmer Bible in his youth and considered this a very special jewel in art. So let's turn to look once again at this sheet, which is one of 12 sheets by Rubens that contain copies after woodcuts by Stimmer. In this very small picture Bible, you can see it in the case upstairs, it's really very small, with woodcuts after his designs. Here, Rubens started with the copy of Judith at the bottom of the sheet. You can see her here, which is taken from this particular woodcut, and this is Job's wife, who is at the top of that sheet, which is from a different woodcut elsewhere in the book. He took Stimmer's woodcuts he took the drawing from the woodcuts Judith killing Holofernes. He was only interested in the figure of the heroine, who stands defiant and strong with her sword in her left hand, while her right hand is reaching for the head of the sleeping Holofernes, moments before she decapitates him. In a note to himself, he jotted down the inscription, zij tast ernaar in het donker, zij tast er in het donker naar, right here, which means she's groping for it, i.e. the head, in the dark. This saved him considerable time adding the dense hatching that we see in Stimmer's print here. Above Judith, as I already said, Rubens copied Job's wife, standing with her arms akimbo from a print on another page, and he ran out of space at the bottom, which is why he drew the end of her dress here, because her head was already there, he just drew it there. Although these are faithful copies of Stimmer's figures, Rubens was being very selective. He only included on this sheet women in defiant poses. And on another sheet, also at the Morgan but not on show, we see only old men taken from various woodcuts in the Stimmer Bible. This high level of selectivity in Rubens' copies after Stimmer suggests that he executed them at an advanced stage of his training while working under his third and last teacher, Otto van Veen, in Antwerp. Already at that young age, we think he was about 18, Rubens was creating a repository of useful motifs that he would use at a later date. And several of the paintings he made during his busiest decade of the 16 teens, for example, reveal that Rubens periodically adopted these motifs from his beloved Stimmer drawings. In fact, he carried these drawings with him all his life, and he was in general very careful with his drawings. Some of these adaptations are literal, and others are more reminiscent of a general pose, which really show that Rubens had internalized Stimmer's examples, such as this wonderful Judith of circa 1615, which is not a copy of the Stimmer, but you can see that with her outstretched arms, she defiantly holds her sword in a very similar manner. In 1600, Rubens left for Italy, where he remained until 1608. He spent most of his time in the service of Vincenzo Gonzaga, Duke of Mantua, and he traveled to many Italian cities and even to Madrid in Spain. Deeply impacted by the first-hand encounter with the art of the Antiquity and the Renaissance, he widely copied and collected models. In some cases, he acquired drawings by Italian artists and subsequently retouched them. A good example in the Morgan's collection is this anonymous red chalk copy of Raphael's ceiling fresco, Psyche offering the jug of water to Venus in the Villa Venesina in Rome, which Rubens retouched in the lower left and central areas with a darker red chalk. You can see it here. This is Rubens's edition. And he often used wetted red chalk, so that's why it gets that really rich, dark red color. In other cases, such as in the profile head of an old man, which you can see upstairs in the show, this is another drawing that we think he may have made in Rome. Rubens reworked the drawing so severely using a combination of dark red chalk and even oil paint, which you can see here in these green applications of oil paint, that it is very difficult to determine whether the original is by him or by another artist. And in fact, we had a look at this drawing in the Thor Conservation Gallery upstairs, the Thor Conservation Studio Center, and we were not able to see any difference between any underdrawing or these upper drawings, the sort of later editions by Rubens. So we're still not sure if this is actually all by Rubens or if it is a retouch drawing. It remains a big question. But the fact that we couldn't see it with a microscope may suggest that it may all be by Rubens. But then why retouch it so much? It's a very interesting problem drawing. Traditionally, the drawing had been interpreted as a copy or a retouch copy after a design by Leonardo da Vinci, whose idiosyncratic head studies, such as this one, Rubens must have been familiar with. But the name of the early 15th century Florentine politician Niccolo da Uzzano, you can see it, he wrote it down there, that's his own handwriting, Rubens, who was active a generation before Leonardo, might suggest that he was working with a much older prototype. So many questions there. But importantly, the ease with which Rubens altered the works of other masters seems utterly baffling to us today. But its roots are deeply embedded in Rubens' own theoretical ideas on art. Particularly important in this respect is his unfinished treatise called De Imitatione Statuarum, probably written in Italy or just after his return in circa 1608, of which only 3 paragraphs survive. From these paragraphs, it becomes clear that for Rubens, art was ever evolving and should always reflect a union between the previous artistic tradition and generation and contemporary observation, preferably from life, in order to make it real, to make it right. Indeed, Rubens continued to copy and improve many other works during the rest of his career, even up until the very end. A great example of which, I think, is this painting of Adam and Eve, which he executed in 1628 to 29 when he was visiting the Royal Collection in Madrid. And he saw the painting by Titian and made this fantastic copy of it. And you can see the differences that he applied. They're actually not very many, and they hang today at the Prado next to each other. But if you look at the differences, they're obviously in the male musculature, which he definitely adjusted, because for him that was his male ideal. It was also in Italy that Rubens developed a keen interest in human anatomy through his first-hand contact with ancient art and the works of Michelangelo as well as Da Vinci, whose anatomical drawings he was privileged to see in 1603 in Madrid, we think, when they were in the collection of the sculptor Leoni. Already during the first years of his Italian period, Rubens appears to have begun a collection of anatomical drawings of his own, which he kept together in his so-called anatomy book, for the rest of his career. And that's where this crochet study from the Casper collection comes in, which was discovered only in 2011, but was, we think, originally part of this anatomy book. As you can see, the figure's left foot is firmly placed on the ground, whereas the right foot is raised slightly above it. We have it here, that's the right foot. Rubens added another study of a right leg from a slightly different angle with less of the sole visible. You can see it here. Here you have more of the sole, and here he added another leg. This addition suggests that Rubens was working from a three-dimensional statue that he could pick up and depict from different vantage points. And although no immediate source for this work is known, it is likely that Rubens had access to an écrochet study such as this one by the 16th century Flemish sculptor Willem van Tetrode. There is no doubt that Rubens' interest in creating these drawings was spurred by his wish to understand the human form in order to be able to create the most credible figures in his work. As for Van Dyck, we don't have a similar large body of youthful copies after prints by him, such as those that we have by Rubens. Part of the contrast with Rubens is no doubt due to the great care that Rubens, as I mentioned earlier, took to preserve his drawings, as famously illustrated by his own will, in which it was stipulated that his drawings should remain together after his death, which obviously did not happen. Another reason is that Van Dyck's earliest trading with history painter Hendrik van Baarle from 1609 to 1611 is shrouded in complete mystery. But perhaps soon after leaving his studio in around 1611 to 1612, but certainly during the years around 1617 to 1620, Van Dyck worked closely with Rubens in his workshop, even after becoming an independent master in 1618. It is therefore not surprising that most of the copies we have from this period are after works by Rubens. A very relevant example in this context is this sheet of circa 1616, which is now in Berlin, so this is not at the Morgan and not in the show, with Van Dyck studies after motifs by Rubens, taken from this painting that we already saw earlier, the Martyrdom of St. Lawrence, which Rubens created in around 1615. As Van Dyck often did in this period, he added elaborate annotations on the colors and the types of light reflections in the prototypes that he was copying. He noted, for example, and I'm going to read the translation of this inscription here, which is talking about these wonderful helmeted figures, a copy of these helmeted figures. That inscription reads that the highlights on the helmets of the soldiers at top right are, quote, minimal because they get the highlights from torches and the highlights are like fire, unquote. And soon afterwards, he inserted precisely these two helmeted men in his own drawing of St. Lawrence in the show upstairs. So you can see that he obviously liked this motif a lot because he added the same motif here, but he actually did it in two different phases. First, he started with a very thin pen, and he added this head here, which you can see is an exact copy of the head right there behind this helmeted guy. And then he changed his mind, and he, with the thicker pen, then in a second campaign, created a different head so as to sort of make it his own, so to speak. He did, however, keep Rubens' minimal light reflections that were instigated by the torchlight, which he made a note of. You can see that even here in his own drawing, there are very, very few light reflections which correspond with those sort of more or less in the example that he had from Rubens. Also, Van Dyck's notes and the manner of adopting motifs offer a rare insight into his early copies, and they suggest that they represented an interaction with the motifs that he deemed interesting, rather than merely a case of gathering stock images. Also, they show that Van Dyck, from a very early age onwards, was interested in matters of light, tone, and atmosphere, and that would remain throughout his life. If we take a closer look at the drawing of St. Lawrence upstairs and the painting by Rubens after which it was modeled, we can even see another way in which Van Dyck was responding to Rubens. St. Lawrence, the protagonist of this image, was martyred on a hot gridiron, and legend has it that he was, not really affected by this, and he was very cool as the flames were rising. He's even said to have demanded just minutes before dying that he be turned over because he was well cooked on one side. Somehow, the St. Lawrence in the painting by Rubens, with his expression of agony and despair, as you can see here, does not quite capture that sentiment, whereas the saint in Van Dyck's drawing does. It seems as though Van Dyck was consciously stepping away from Rubens' example in favor of a more accurate historical interpretation. And that was not the only time that he would do that in his career. People have often said that Rubens is such an overpowering influence on all of Flemish art, and definitely on Van Dyck and Jordaens, but it was because of their talent and their extraordinary artistic capacity that they were able to become their own masters. And it's very interesting to see these early drawings in which you can really see how that happens. Van Dyck's method for preparing paintings changed quite radically during the course of his career. When he was working under Rubens as a young artist, he tended to use large numbers of drawings to work out his compositions, such as this Mystic Marriage of Catherine, which is one of 7 drawings that he created in order to prepare the large painting now in the Prado that we saw, and that is up here. Scholars have long noted the connection between the young Van Dyck's high number of preparatory studies and his wish to impress the great Rubens. More than that, however, it appears that through these high numbers of drawings, he was able to assert himself as an artist as he moved away from the first composition very close to a painting by Rubens to a solution of his own, just like we saw with the St. Lawrence. In the case of St. Catherine, he was also looking at the work of Titian, to whose art he was exposed, again, through Rubens before going to Italy himself. And after Van Dyck left Rubens' atelier, he never used this many preparatory studies for paintings again. And in fact, the number of sketches dwindled so much that one wonders whether he sometimes painted directly on the support. He really stopped drawing as many studies as later on in life. But in 1621, Van Dyck went to Italy as well, just like Rubens had, where he would stay until around 1627. In a sketchbook that he owned during this period, and which is now at the British Museum in London, he recorded a great number of paintings, prints, drawings, and sculptures, mostly by his Italian contemporaries and by leading artists of the previous century, particularly Titian, whose art he could now finally see in situ. There are very few drawings after classical sculpture and antiquity, a lack that has long been noted and contrasted with the abundance of drawings by Rubens, but it appears that there must have been more than survive. If we take a look, for example, at this fantastic drawing, one of the best at the show, I think, as I already said, which is normally dated to after Van Dyck's return from Italy, the abundant Italian sources that have so far gone unnoted suggest that maybe he did make it in Italy, because there are quite a lot in this image, which I will show you now. So what we're seeing here is the moon goddess Diana, who is identified by her crescent moon on her head, fell in love with the beautiful young shepherd Endymion and had him cast into an eternal sleep so that she could visit him and admire him every night. Now, Van Dyck seems to have started with the contours of the group at bottom left, which you can see here, which shows Diana planting a kiss on the cheek of the young shepherd as he lies asleep, his head propped up by his right hand and his legs spread. Van Dyck then faintly outlined the other solution at top right, which you can see there, depicting the sleeping Endymion with crossed legs and Diana placing a hand on his cheek while tenderly admiring him. He then returned to the first drawing and worked it up with a thicker pen and gorgeous, rich washes. It is impossible to imagine that Van Dyck conceived this image without seeing Annibale Carracci's trailblazing composition in the famous ceiling frescoes in the Farnese Gallery in Rome of circa 1597 to 1604. The correspondence between Diana's embrace and Endymion and the way in which both goddesses are depicted from the waist up are indeed striking. If you look at here on it, you see that she's sort of coming out of this amazing, out of nowhere. For the second sketch at the top of the page, Van Dyck may have turned to the 1609 fresco by the Carracci pupil Domenichino in the Palazzo Giustiniani in Bassano Romano. Finally, it is possible that for the unusual pose of Endymion's legs, which you see here, very unusual pose, Van Dyck may have turned to the Roman statue of the fallen Gaul, which was very famous in its time and still is, and was already in Venice during Van Dyck's stay there and remains there today in the Archaeological Museum. So now, finally, let's focus on Jordaens as well. In 1615, Jordaens left his master, Adam van Noort's studio, and he registered as a waterschilder, which probably meant that he produced watercolor paintings on canvas, a more affordable substitute for tapestries. None of the paintings in this delicate medium by Jordaens survive, and he appears to have switched to oil painting relatively soon. Furthermore, no drawings by Jordaens from his time with Van Noort survive, and little can be said about his earliest exposure to drawing and copying practices. But unlike Rubens's and Van Dyck's teachers, Adam van Noort never went to Italy, which automatically limited Jordaens' repository of Italian source material. Jordaens, too, famously never traveled south of the Alps himself. But if we are to believe his first biographer, Joachim von Sandrart, he sorely regretted this, and he tried to compensate by studying many works by Titian, Veronese, Caravaggio, and anything he could possibly get his hands on. And it is in that context that this drawing is particularly interesting, although the attribution is not unanimously supported. But there are very few drawings that actually record Jordaens' copies after Italian works, even though we see it in his paintings. The earliest one, which is this one, representing a couple in an embrace after this drawing by Titian, is important because it is as much evidence for Jordaens working under Rubens as it is for his study of Italian art. And although documentary evidence is lacking, there are visual and stylistic arguments suggesting that Jordaens spent time in Rubens' workshop between 1615 and 1620, so around the same time that Van Dyck was there. Because the motif from Titian's drawing appears in one of Rubens' paintings from circa 1615, it has been suggested that it was in Rubens' collection of drawings and that Jordaens could have seen it there. So that in itself is a very interesting thing to think about, that this drawing was owned by Rubens and that the young Jordaens can have seen it and copied it there because he was just hungry for source material from Italy. We may assume that Jordaens copied many more drawings while surrounded by Rubens' large collection, not least works by the great Flemish master himself, since Jordaens remained deeply indebted to Rubens his entire career. Note, for instance, the close correspondences between the composition of the Christ Among the Doctors of circa 1663 in the exhibition and Rubens' discussion of the Holy Sacrament in St. Paul's Church in Antwerp of 1609, so more than half a century earlier. Indeed, by 1641, after the death of both Rubens and van Dyck, Jordaens had become the most desirable and sought artist in Antwerp, and in order to keep up with this high demand, he more than once harked back to older motifs and even repeated some of his own. Jordaens also endlessly interacted with written sources. He had a deep-rooted interest in combining classical mythology and genre painting, and therefore merging elite and popular culture, as modern art historians often say. He revisited the subject of the satyr and the peasant, for instance, many times in his career. Aesop's story talks of the satyr who is baffled at witnessing the peasant first blow on his hands to warm them up, and then with the same breath blow on his porridge to cool it down. But he decides that this peasant, someone who blows hot and cold, is not to be trusted. Throughout his career, Jordaens interacted on a philosophical level with this story. In the 1620s, for example, he portrayed the satyr as an old philosopher, engaging in a discussion with the farmer on the ambiguity of human existence. In this work, the vine leaves around the satyr's head, you can see them right there, and his weary gesture highlights his Dionysian background and maybe the source of a little bit too much to drink, and so that being the source of his wisdom. And that implication of in vino veritas is wholly unambiguous in Jordaens' repetition of this composition of circa 1650, in which he replaced the satyr with a konijker, which in Dutch means somebody who's constantly looking in his glass. So he really revisited this theme in many different ways during a period of many decades. Another aspect that is highlighted in this exhibition is that of the nude study. In fact, the three nudes in the show form the center of each wall. By the time van Dyck and Jordaens arrived in Rubens' workshop in 1615, they would have been able to witness Rubens' practice of making studies after nude models for specific studies in the paintings. They might perhaps have seen this seated nude, that's the seated nude youth that Rubens made a few years earlier in circa 1613 for his monumental painting, Daniel in the Lion's Den, today at the National Gallery in, oh, I'm sorry, that's another one, well, today in the National Gallery of Art, which you already saw earlier. In this study, Rubens defined Daniel's contours in black chalk with his usual bold precision, and he modeled the figure with delicately stumped passages in black chalk and white highlights. Although few scholars doubt that this model was drawn from life, there is a striking artistic source that Rubens must have followed as well. For this study, Rubens presumably asked a male model, possibly a student, to pose in exactly the same position as the figure of Saint Jerome in a drawing by Muziano, one of the drawings that Rubens very likely owned himself. And for the figure's expression, with his half-open mouth and upward-gazing eyes, Rubens may even have thought of this famous Hellenistic marble, the so-called Dying Alexander. With this typical approach, Rubens combined his newly acquired knowledge of the old masters with observations from life, which, as we know, he deemed essential for good art. The few differences between the figure in the painting and on the page demonstrate that Rubens made the study at a very advanced stage in the painting process, when he knew exactly where he wanted to place the figure. The Daniel drawing betrays the deep knowledge of anatomy and classical sculpture that Rubens had acquired in Italy, and the care that he invested in bringing his figure to life on the paper. The musculature and the volume of the body are convincing and impressive. You can see, for example, that there are very few differences. Here you have the hands are slightly closer to the face than in the drawing, but other than that, he just took the whole drawing and put it into his painting. The numerous new studies by Jordaens and van Dyck from the years that they were with Rubens demonstrate that both artists adopted the practice of drawing from nude models. One of the most impressive studies by Jordaens is this recently discovered study of a male nude, which is upstairs in the exhibition on loan from a private collection. And Jordaens took great care to depict the complex muscle structure of the burly man's back with a combination of strong white highlights in white chalk and perfectly placed accent in red and black chalk. You should see, you can't really see it very well on this reproduction, but if you look upstairs, note the red highlights every now and then in his hair, which he does in other nude studies as well. The result is a wonderfully sculptural and utterly convincing torso. Jordaens used the same figure in this equally impressive oil sketch, now on the Paris art markets. And it is clear that even without an extended trip to Italy, Jordaens, through Rubens, was very aware of the lessons offered by the study of antique sculpture in combination with live sittings. Neither Van Dyck nor Jordaens continued the practice of regularly drawing from the nude model after they left Rubens' workshop. Van Dyck, however, did revisit this practice a few times in his career, as far as we know. At the end of his career, he executed a beautifully introverted study of a man's torso for the dead body of a Christ in a Lamentation, which is one of Van Dyck's more personal and moving renditions of Christ's dead body. With delicate strokes of black chalk and perfectly placed white chalk highlights, the artist tenderly made the figure emerge, almost like a spiritual apparition, from the subdued blue of the paper. The most extraordinary application of white chalk is that of the soft, stumped passages on Christ's chest that masterfully suggest corporal volume and frailty at the same time. His approach to the human form, however, differs from Jordaens and Rubens. He appears to have been less interested in creating the illusion of a full, strapping, three-dimensional body than in getting the tonal values and realistic light reflections correct. As a result, his drawn nude is appropriately lifeless, and the shimmering play of light and shadow created by the white chalk is hauntingly realistic. As he had learned from Rubens, Van Dyck waited until he was far advanced with the composition and knew exactly where he wanted the figure to go before asking the model to pose for him. As you see, there are very few differences again. Here he had another possibility for an arm. He has two, but in the end he opted for the lower arm because if you look at the painting, the higher arm would have interfered with Mary's arm there. So in conclusion, the selection of drawings in this exhibition shows that drawings played an integral part of the working processes of Rubens, Van Dyck, and Jordaens. Rubens used drawings to copy profusely from other masters and to dialogue with them through his corrections on their work, to practice his knowledge of anatomy, to record his ideas for compositions, to work out his compositions, to draw figures from life, and many, many more reasons. There is hardly anything that he created that did not start on the paper. He was at once obsessed with truthfulness in creating seemingly living and breathing figures, and with beauty in creating graceful compositions in which the figures interact in a credible way. As we saw from his letter to William Trumbull at the beginning, both violent and harmonious compositions could be graceful to Rubens, as long as the figures were real and powerful. To put it a bit simplistically, and I do hesitate, but here I go. For Rubens, you can say that graceful was a logical result of powerful. In other words, without power, you could not have grace. So it was first, something had to be powerful, and then the grace would come from that. Bear with me here. These concerns he worked out on the paper in his compositional sketches and in his individual figures. Being informed about anatomy and the workings of the body was key. Now, Van Dyck also copied artworks, as we've seen, by other masters, particularly Rubens, but he was much less fanatic about the practice than Rubens was, as far as we know. When he did copy, he was more interested in the colors and the light reflections of the motifs that he was copying, and less concerned with sculpture and human form. As the 2012 exhibition on the young Van Dyck in the Prado made clear, the young Van Dyck was aware of style and of finding his own. An inscription that he added to a very early drawing depicting an abduction scene with several figures in swirling draperies notes the airy style that he wishes to create. And it can be argued similarly that the many compositional drawings of his early career served as steps in the path away from Rubens' examples, as we've seen. But later on in his career, Van Dyck's elongated figures became the epitome of grace. And even he himself was very aware of the word grace, and he wrote about it several times. As we saw with his exquisite study for the dead Christ, Van Dyck was more concerned with creating the most realistic, palpable light effects on the dead body's skin than maybe on depicting the mass of that body. But it is that graceful realism that gives it the power and that impacts us. And I hesitate again to make another simplistic statement, but you can say that it's the other way around for Van Dyck, in that without grace there is no impact, there's no power. Jordaens' compositional drawings are highly idiosyncratic in technique and betray his early career as a waterschilder. Their mixture of media is really quite complex and includes different colors, chalk, watercolor, and, as recent examination for this catalogue has shown, charcoal. In fact, it seems as though he used charcoal to start every single one of his drawings. What is more, Jordaens was rather creative with the paper support, and he routinely added strips or even flaps. This is my favorite example from the Fondation Custodia in Paris, this great drawing, in which he added a flap to reveal an alternative solution for a compositional motif, such as this drawing. Jordaens' creative process developed organically through the contact with the physical paper, which in turn had to develop and change shape with him. His ideas often continue to evolve during the painting process, which in the case of the drawing that we can see upstairs, Christ among the doctors, meant that the addition of strips around the margin of the original drawing correspond to the addition of canvas strips to the painting. So here we have the original drawing without these strips on the back, on the side, and then he made this painting. And then he added these strips on the canvas, and without sort of winging it, he had to go back to the original drawing, and he added strips of paper in order to see the composition that way. So he was really very, it was a very physical contact that he had with this paper. Of the three protagonists in the exhibition, Jordaens' reputation suffered most from a one-sided historiographical treatment. As an artist who was not employed by the European courts on a regular basis and whose clientele consisted mostly of the wealthy bourgeois, he has often been discussed as the jolly artist of vernacular life, influenced by Rubens but lacking the master's serious outlook. Recent exhibitions, in particular Jordaens and the Antique from 2012 to 2013, have made great efforts to adjust this image and to demonstrate that beside the obvious debt to Rubens, Jordaens' pictorial language and choice of subject matter were deeply rooted in conscientious study of a wide range of classical literature, as we saw with the satyr and the peasant. It is thus in his compositional drawings, more than in his copies and figure studies, that we witness his development as he translated literary sources into pictorial ideas. One of the few letters by Jordaens that survives is a note to Constantijn Huygens about the importance of artistic freedom in order to be able to create and invent. And indeed, Jordaens spent his whole career inventing compositions with paper as his most loyal tool. So thank you very much for coming today, and I hope you enjoyed the exhibition. Thank you.